we're doing well tonight, aren't we? Ooh. I think we should adopt that. I like that. That was wonderful, thank you. Well, our next storyteller barely really needs any introduction because you all know him. But you might not know that Michael McRay served as a volunteer at Riverbend Maximum Security Prison for 4.5 years. He served as a volunteer chaplain there for a year until the warden banned him for organizing on behalf of the inmates. I think we should thank that warden because now he organizes 10x9 Nashville. Please welcome your host and founder, Michael McRay.
I'm also glad that I had read Kate's before, and I'm glad I didn't have to read that either because I didn't have that much energy. That was fantastic. This is going to change tone quite a bit. Trigger warnings, explicit language in this story, descriptions of violence, and mention of rape. He kept his cell dark. Sometimes the sunlight lit the cell through the narrow window, but he usually dimmed it with a makeshift newspaper curtain. It took many long conversations to hear some of his story, but after only a couple of visits, I knew one thing for certain. Marcus Hammonds preferred the dark. I met Marcus while working as a volunteer chaplain at Riverbend Maximum Security at prison here in Nashville. Not only does Riverbend house Tennessee's death row, but it houses what at the time was one of the worst units in the Department of Corrections, Unit 4, the mental health unit on the maximum security side. Marcus was in Unit 4. The day I began chaplaincy work in that unit, I happened to start my rounds with his cell. I strained my eyes to see him in the unlit room. Finally, he turned on the light. He was young, in his mid-20s like me, and his face was clean. His brown eyes screamed rage behind his large-rimmed glasses, and his bulky body served him well surviving prison. His attention span was as short as his fuse, and his thick arms displayed dozens of scars, primarily on his left. Most scars were only an inch or two long, but they ran deep. Marcus was a cutter. His self-abuse was as habitual as his fury. Few could appease him, or at least few tried. Almost every time I saw him, he ticked like a bomb about to explode. Often, I found I could temporarily de-escalate by maintaining a calm tone, keeping my body relaxed, and paying attention to what he was saying. When he felt heard and respected, his anger softened. Yet even in those moments of relative cool, Marcus still spoke of violence. One day, after he had begun to trust me more, he offered a confession. I dream of murder, both while awake and asleep. Marcus shuffled back and forth steadily, wringing his hands together as if he was rinsing them under a faucet. He then reiterated, sometimes I just sit in the dark and obsess about murder. He then described to me in detail his plan for killing the staff members of the prison whenever the Department of Corrections released him. This was a first for me. I had never talked with someone about a desire to kill. Of course, there was the time an Israeli soldier pointed a rifle at my face and said, I want to shoot you through the head with this bullet, but we didn't really discuss it. I tried to explore Marcus's feelings, though, for a while, and in the process learned more of his story. He told me of growing up in poverty, how even as a child he had to steal sometimes to provide food for his family of 3. He told me about witnessing the murder of friends and family. He told me about how his mother used extension cords to beat him and his sister. He told me of his first experience locked up, arrested for throwing a rock at the head of a white girl who had actually thrown the first stone. He was charged, she was not. He told me he was 12. Marcus was like a boomerang. Whenever the Department of Corrections threw him out, he just came right back. The system claimed to be rehabilitating, but I wondered what it was habilitating him back to. The environment of dysfunction and violence that sent him to prison was the same environment to which he returned. State punishment had not cured the diseases of poverty, neglect, and abuse. I asked him if he always obsessed about murder. Nah, chaplain, he shook his head, peering off behind me as if searching through memories. It all started after coming here to Max. The Department of Corrections had been locking Marcus in a maximum security cell for a couple of years. While in Max, Marcus remains alone in his cell, confined for 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. His typical human encounters involved frequent antagonistic interactions with staff. Occasionally he phones his sister or a cousin, but to my knowledge, he never received visitors. I saw then that the prison was functioning as a self-fulfilling prophecy. It further broke an already broken man so thoroughly that he was now truly a danger to others and should not be released. Prison had created a need for itself. One day I walked into Unit 4 and Marcus shouted to me, "Chaplain, come here now!" Trying to stay relaxed, I climbed the steel stairs to my left and asked what was going on. Marcus ripped his shirt off, revealing a fresh, deep slice just above his shorts. Bouncing with rage, he then turned and showed me his left arm, and 2 raw wounds stared back at me. I asked him why. Pacing behind his door, he shouted back, "Nobody listens to me. I ask the officers for something, and they just ignore me. My therapist won't come see me. I need to talk to someone about these thoughts in my head, but nobody gives a fuck." I suggested he just start talking to me. With seething resentment, Marcus recounted his newest violent fantasies. I listened for some time as he spat his anger out like a poison. He had cut himself a few hours before, but medical workers only gave him some gauze and band-aids. Apparently he didn't cut deep enough. I asked if he still had the razors. He reached up on his shelf and then opened his hand. 3 small blades, pried from disposable shaving razors, rested in his left palm with dried blood still visible. He stood there with cupped hands, almost as if he was receiving the Eucharist from a priest. I assumed my next question would be met with laughing dismissal, but I had to try. "Would you be willing to give me those razors?" Much to my surprise, Marcus didn't shoot down my question. He looked at me for what seemed like minutes, considering my request. Then he smiled slightly and said, "I'm sorry, Chaplain, I can't. These razors are my voice." His last sentence hit me in the gut. He cuts to be heard. This was the 5th reason I had discovered for self-mutilation in prison. Once, when Mr. Hayfield came back from medical, I asked him why he cut himself. "Sometimes I get really bored," he said to me. When I asked Mr. Saylor why he so often cut, he confessed to raping his 5-year-old niece. "I hate myself. I deserve to suffer and be in pain forever." Mr. Freeman once explained that sometimes he cuts because he feels relief when he does it. "Sometimes it feels good," he said. Sam told me that he mutilates himself to black out so that he can escape the hell of prison for at least a few moments. Mr. Freeman admitted the same. "When they have to take me to the infirmary, I can look up at the sky. And I get to spend a night or two with a little bit of peace and quiet away from the chaos." And now, Marcus told me he cuts to be heard. I stood there looking at Marcus, feeling nearly traumatized at this realization. In this Department of Corrections, it seemed little correcting was actually occurring. "Do you feel heard when you cut?" I asked him. "Well," he chuckled, "I tend to get what I need much quicker than when I just ask for it." As I spoke with Marcus, I soon began to realize that he did not really prefer the dark. The dark provided him with plausible deniability. Marcus wanted to be seen, but even in the light, he was ignored. Darkness gave him a concrete reason for his seeming invisibility. But Marcus does not prefer the dark. In fact, Marcus would kill to be seen. Thank you.